The user interface is a very interesting one in terms of how it's changed over time because a user interface, usually you'd think of something like this. So the interface you're using now on a computer, most people think, oh, it's just a graphical user interface. That's the whole point. Well, that's not true because some of you will know of command line interfaces, for example. So a graphical user interface, usually commonly shortened down to GUI, um, they're the most common because obviously for most people they don't know how to use command line and don't know how to use any other sort of system, so they tend to stick with a graphical one because you can see what's happening. Obviously, for graphical user interfaces, um, it it really impacts your performance of your computer. Really, your computer would be able to be a lot faster if it didn't need to constantly show you what's happening. If the PC system could be left to literally do what it's supposed to and perform operations considering the inputs you give it, it would run a lot faster. So they're a lot slower because the processing power needs to produce graphics takes up quite a lot of the time of the computer. Now, a CLI, which we should have already had a look at before, which is a command line interface, is quite a common one. It all used to be common before the GUI came into place, but obviously a lot of people still use it. Um, just sort of give you an idea of what this looks like. So if I put it on full screen, so this is part of my setup. As you can see, like I've got a background, like all this is a graphical user interface. But if we were to show this, so this is a command line. So I can type in commands and go like show IP config or something like that. Oh, it's not show IP config on here. I forget. It's just IP config. You can actually look at different things on here. Depends on what it is. So a command line, it's still commonly used because um, it was something that was used well before GUIs were used. So it's quite a common occurrence still, and a lot of computing systems still use it. As you can also see on there, menu interfaces have been mentioned. So menu interfaces you've probably seen before, especially if you have a smart TV or something like that. It's literally just menu based, which means that you can't do specific functions on it. You can't run anything outside of that menu. It's literally just that menu, and that is it. And it can just do single task operations. So smart TVs usually have things like change channel or change brightness or something like that. A lot of monitors do. They are user interfaces for an operating system, but they're just very, very, very basic, and that's why they can only do single task operations. So they're nothing spectacular. Um, Smartphones obviously will use iOS and Android. They're the most common ones. I know there are some other ones out there. I know BlackBerry is still sort of around. They have their own operating system, BlackBerry OS. But obviously they will use touchscreens instead to interact with the UI. So this is a completely different way with interacting with the UI. Because at the minute, as you can see me flailing around on here, I've got a mouse, and the mouse is quite common for user interface on a computer. But technically, we don't need it. I could literally just use this keyboard here. So I have a keyboard. I don't know if this will show up on camera. So I've got a keyboard. That's the way I'm interfacing with my computer right now. I don't have to use that. I could just use my mouse. But really, keyboards were the main sort of inputs for user interfaces, especially with command line, because for command line you do not need a mouse whatsoever. There are all sorts of other user interfaces. So as we said before, an Alexa device, they use voice in order to interact with it. So that's their user interface. Their user interface is voice operated. There's some that use eye tracking instead, so you can actually look at the screen and see what's going on. It depends on what type of user interface is needed for that system. So what you'll need to sort of do when you ever talk about user interfaces is that it really depends on what you need it for. Because you could have a user interface that is fantastically fancy, does all these nice things that you might find easy, but for your average person who wants to get a computer, they might not know anything about it, and it might be really difficult for them. So it depends on what their needs are and what their preferences are as well. But the user interfaces will vary depending on what they need it for. Um, so please, please, please look at this and make sure that you keep this in mind if you're ever talking about user interfaces, that it can depend on what you need it for.